nice to meet you is necessary. From this time, we will learn about the state of class-based components. We will look at what a state object is and how it is applied. As this state information is closely related to a state management container called MobX later, so it is important to understand its concept and use it well. Let's first look at the theoretical content of what a state is and how to apply it. Let's take time to fully understand through simple examples. So let's get started. The props we learned in the previous lecture were data from the parent component that contained them. From the standpoint of receiving this data, the prop value can be set to be immutable because this object cannot be changed. This series of actions that the component change data according to various situations or events, and the UI is updated when the data is changed, is one of the basic functions that this component should have. To make this possible, the component must first able to have mutable data. Likewise, when this data changes, the UI must also be updated. It is this state object that enables these things. Class-based components unconditionally use this state object. In the case of function-based components, a separate method called hooks is used. When the data held by this state object is changed, it means that the UI is changed. React components will re-render when state and prop data change. The use of this state object has its own rules. First, the state object initialization proceeds with this state initialization in the constructor or in the declaration section that declares the object field of the component. And to change this state value, you have to use a method called setState. So if you use a non-set state assigned to change a value in a space other than a constructor or in a non-declaration part of this field, the function of updating the screen when the state changes when the data is changed is not implemented. So when using state, you have to decide where to use this initialization area, whether to use it as a constructor or whether to proceed at the part that initializes the object field. Now, as you know well, a constructor is a special method that is called when a class is instantiated. In general, in many books, initialization of state is performed in the constructor. Now, as you can see, it means that initialization can proceed like this. If you need to change the value in this state, as you can see, a method called setState is using here in the below box, and then using setState to update the data from the state. Now you need to know this basically so that you can basically use a very minimal state. In fact, if we use a container that manages the state called MobX, we don't use the state as you can see right now. But the concept of this state is something you must know. This concept is a very important concept, so you should be aware of it. From now on, a simple example. Let's see how to use a state through this very simple counter example and what it means to use the state by changing the state value. The example is simple. It has two buttons. There is one button expressing the value of this number type. So I will try to implement the thing that this value changes when the plus minus is done using the state. Now let's proceed with the practice. First of all, I did two tasks in advance. As you can see, I created a React project called Simple Counter using CRA, After the project called Simple Counter was created like this, I moved the project and installed the module to the Material UI. As you can see in package.json, you can see I downloaded Material UI Core in advance. Since we are going to use Material UI component for a component called a button or a box, we added this Material UI. As you can see, files like this will be created inside the Simple Counter project under the SRC folder. Since this is a very simple example, I will not organize separate CSS files over this part. We will create a component called counter so that the app component has a structure in the form of including this counter component. Now, let's create a new file called counter.js. And we will import React and component from React library. And after, since I told you I'm going to use the Material UI component called box and the button, we will import it, button and box from Material UI core. And after, we will put class, and name of the class will be counter, and extends React component. And as what I told you in the last lecture, when we create the class, we have to have render method, and inside render method, we need to have return statement. In this return statement, the subject that returns in the React element, which either returns a single React element or a list of elements that fit into an array. Usually, it is a form that returns one React element. Now, in order to return one React element, we will return by placing two buttons and one box component, but we will wrap it up with div tag, so we will type div, and inside div we will type button, and inside the button we will put box. And now inside of tag, let's add a button component and a box component, but I'm going to add some Material UI properties to this button component and box component. One of them is called variant, and we will give option of contained in the box one. And we will put the color attribute is designated as primary, and the size option can also be specified. So we will give the size option is the largest option, and the value to be expressed by this button is designated by plus button. So we are done with the first button. And after that, now I'm going to make two buttons which will be plus and minus. So I'm going to add one more button and give same options and put color primary and give size as large, but we are going to give this as a minus button option. And you can understand that this box component is a component that wraps in a span tag or a div tag used in basic HTML. It is the component that wraps with the Material UI component that simply wraps. I will apply the span tag to the component to be wrapped with the box, so specify the component as a span tag. And in order to give the space between this box and the button, I will give the margin option as 5. And I'm going to put a value of 0 as constant value here. Since we are still before using the state, we will just first check whether the screen is actually displayed. After configuring like this, immediately put the export default, and put counter so that the counter can be used outside, and we will save it. Let's go to the app.js file and delete all the code inside the div tag, and let's put counter that we created and import it. Don't forget to write this import code yourself if this auto import doesn't work. Now save it. After save it like this, we will actually proceed with yarn start and check that this component is executed, and screen should be appear pretty soon. So let's wait for a while and the screen should appear. I have space first for testing. Now you can see the plus button and then the minus button, and the value of 0 is expressed in the box or displayed like this. Now before changing the state value so that the value of 0 displayed in this box can be displayed using the state, we will modify the counter component so that it can be expressed as a state value. Now let's go back to counter.js file. Now let's put the initialization for the state can usually be done in the constructor. So let's put constructor. And in addition to this state, we need to actually put the data of the mutable values in this state value. There may be several types of data, so generally assign is performed in the form of an object. So we will put it as object. Of course, we are going to specify one value, so we specify one value, make a count value, 0. If you specify this state, the value of this state will be able to use in the component now. But I will change this value of 0 a little. I will initialize it as a value of 5 for classification. And you can make this state and the count value in the box, but if you run it like this, you can change 0 to this dot state dot count value, and if you save it, if you run it like this, an error will occur. If you look at what kind of error will occur, it means that when it is executed, an object called this is not assigned to an object called this. That is the problem occurs because the object called this is used before this object is created. In other words, when you create these components, that is, when creating class-based components, when you define a constructor, you need to add superconstructor before this dot state. It should be called as the constructor of the React component above me through the superconstructor, but this object is applicable. And when you save it, so if you define the super constructor like this, the error you just saw disappears and you can see that it is set to a value of 5. Then you have finished initializing the value of the state. Now you just need to create events method and implement only increments and decrements when these buttons are pressed. Later, when we talk about life cycle, we will talk about life cycle in the next lecture. Talking about this superconstructor, originally the basic principle is to take a prop as a parameter and pass the prop to the superconstructor. First, I will write function called increment and another one will be called decrement. We will make two methods like this. Now in the two methods, we are going to increment the value of the state by 1 or decrement it by 1. When changing the state value, we need to use setState in this method. So we'll put this dot setState and put count value that we will update it, and we'll call it this dot state count value plus 1. And same thing for the decrement, we will use this dot setState and put the update value, and we will call this dot state count value minus 1. I need to pass an object to be changed as a parameter to this method. So I define counter as what value will be passed to this method. The value here will be plus 1 to this state count. As a parameter of the setState method, you put a value that changes the object of the state. If you think of overriding, it will be much easier to understand. So if you do this, you can even change the state through a method called setState. Now when an event occurs in the button, only call the increment method and call the decrement method. How to write the code? There is a property called onClick. So in the button, we will put button onClick and put the curly braces. In addition to this, you can pass this dot increment method we just defined. The part that should not be left out here is called bind this. I will tell you more about this part in the end. For now, since it is the part that focuses on the state, you just need to recognize that you need to call the event method like this. Likewise, in the negative button, we will put on click, put curly braces, this dot decrement bind this. Now write this and then save. If you save it like this, it is actually reflected. If you press the button, you can see the value it is changing. Now, it is a simple example, but there are parts that we can't talk about in detail like this right now. You can approach this exercise from the point of view of using state only to the extent that a method called setState is used and the initialization is defined in this form in the constructor. Now, in the next lecture, I will explain a little more about the state with a more example the last time we sprayed the list with the props. I will expand it to state and proceed with state management in more detail. I will finish this lecture here. I hope it helped you understand a basic concept of state. Thank you. See you next time.